My name is Tim Oakes. I'm the faculty director of the Center for Asian Studies, and I'm just going to introduce today's panel speakers, and I'm not going to have much more to say since they're the experts on this, but I do want to put this in a little bit of context. Center for Asian Studies over the past several years has been developing Southeast Asian studies through initially through a grant that we received from the Department of Education, a undergraduate international studies and foreign language grant through the Department of Education's Title VI program, and we've used that to try to bolster the Southeast Asian studies curriculum, to increase Southeast study abroad opportunities in Southeast Asia, among other things. And this panel is kind of partly an outcome of that and a continuation of that effort to promote and develop Southeast Asian studies on campus. And it's also in order to kind of help us kick off a new exchange program that we have just launching with Gajah Mada University in Yogyakarta. And you'll be hearing more details about that exchange program, which is, we have the website up from the Education Abroad page for the site, which is just started, so we're hoping to generate interest in and answer questions that people might have about the exchange program, obviously about Indonesia, living in Indonesia, Indonesian society and culture more generally. So let me just introduce today's speakers, and then I'm going to hand it over to them. So I'll introduce them collectively, and then they'll kind of take over. And I'll start with Stan Harsha, who will be starting off our comments today. Stan is a former U.S. diplomat with well over 20 years of experience, most of it, or all of it, in Asia, I think, in the Foreign Service, with expertise in education and cultural exchanges. He has served in various positions in Asia, most of which in Indonesia, including serving as the United States Consul General for Sumatra. Currently, he is president of the U.S.-Asia International Education Exchanges, where he advocates for educational exchange between Asia and the United States. And he has certainly been doing that on behalf of CU, and has been, more than anybody, I think, the major engine that has enabled this new exchange program, and that has really helped us keep the Southeast Asian Studies Initiative going. So Stan has been a huge help. He's a member of the Center for Asian Studies Advisory Council. He's also the author of a critically acclaimed book, Like the Sun and the Moon, published in 2015 about Indonesia. Following Stan will be Carla Jones, Associate Professor of Anthropology here at CU Boulder. Carla works on a number of topics in contemporary Indonesia: middle class consumption, gender, Islamic fashion, among other things. And I believe has also spent quite a bit of time at UGM in Yogyakarta, and will be able to offer us some perspectives from her experience there as well. And then following Carla will be Rachel Ronaldo, Associate Professor of Sociology, a cultural sociologist interested in gender and social change, particularly in the context of Muslim societies in Southeast Asia. And she's done a lot of her research in Indonesia on feminism, on divorce and families in Indonesia. And she's going to share some of her experiences doing fieldwork and living, and some of her work in Indonesia. She's also the author of the 2013 book Mobilizing Piety, Islam and Feminism in Indonesia. Once again, thank you all for coming. Thanks to our panelists. I think we'll also maybe be hearing from Cloud from Education Abroad, who will also be able to tell us some of the more details about the exchange program. But we'll start with Stan. So thanks,
Okay,
Stan.
thank you very much.
Are you going to stand?
I'll probably just stay here. Okay. So anyway, I'm Stan Harsha. I'm going to give an overview of Indonesia, not a really deep overview, but I think it's kind of overview that I think could be useful for anybody who's interested in going to Indonesia and participating in the study abroad program. Okay, so this is a view. Indonesia is a stunningly beautiful country. This is actually a view of the rice terraces in Bali, which is actually not too far from Yogyakarta, about an hour and a half flight. This sounds a little bit hokey, but I think it's such an important factor in wanting to be in Indonesia because the people are just so warm and happy and warm and friendly. So, so just think Mexico if you want to know how happy they are. They're just extremely, extremely warm, and everybody just falls in love with the Indonesian smiles. That's a more important factor than any of the other sort of cultural and natural beauty reasons to go there. So Indonesia is really interesting because it's on the Ring of Fire, which makes it exciting all the time because there's always like an earthquake or a volcanic eruption or a tsunami someplace. Not too many tsunamis, but don't worry about it because things like volcanic eruptions, it's like a snowstorm if you're in Indonesia. Okay, you just kind of live with it. So this is a map of Indonesia. Just to give you just an overview, the island in the middle is Java, right below there where it says Jakarta right there, and Yogyakarta is there kind of in the middle, that red dot at the bottom of the map. And that's where the University of Gajah Mada is located, in the cultural and historical center of the country. This gives you a sense of the size of Indonesia. So you can see that it has over 17,000 islands, and some of these islands are very, very small. But hundreds of them are inhabited, and some of these islands are huge. Okay, so the island of Java, for example, is about the size of half the size of Colorado. Sumatra is about the size of California. It's very, very diverse religiously, and you may know this about Indonesia. But what makes Indonesia special is tolerance. There's a real syncretism of religion, so that Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and Buddhists, they all practice their religion in a really, really syncretic way, with animism, with Hinduism built on top of animism, and Buddhism built on top of Hinduism, and Islam built on top of Hinduism, so that in Java, many of their Islamic practices are actually a lot more Hindu than they are anything else, which makes Indonesia very, very special religiously because of the syncretism and the tolerance. So there's over 300 ethnic groups in Indonesia which speak distinct languages or dialects, and while it has a national language which everybody speaks, it unifies the country. The local languages and cultures are still very strong. There's nothing homogeneous about the Indonesian phenotype. There are all kinds of different features, from the lightest skin to the darkest skin, and which really you cannot distinguish Indonesians by any particular feature. And the food is fantastic. Unfortunately, there's very little good Indonesian food in the United States. There is the Jaya Grill in East Denver. But it is just incredibly delicious. It's just as delicious and varied as Thai food, maybe even Chinese food. So if you live there, you will constantly be yearning for all the different spices, and you'll be yearning for it even more when you come back. So it's strategically very important because it's on the South China Sea. There's so much commerce that goes through the country, which makes the country really strategically extremely important. It has the second highest biodiversity in the world, the third largest tropical forest. There's two places where you have orangutan, which means man of the forest. And if you study there, there'll be an opportunity for you to fly a couple hours and go into the jungle and have a direct encounter with orangutan, as well as the Komodo dragons. So, and economically, a lot of people don't realize what a big economic power is and how fast it's growing. And so particularly under the current government, which is very, very effective and very honest government of Joko Widodo, but with growing 5 to 6% a year, it's projected to be the fourth largest economy by 2050. So opportunities to be involved in the Indonesian economy in the future are tremendous. It's the world's most populous country, the third largest democracy, and it has a really fantastic, thriving democracy. In today's world, it may be one of the most thriving democracies. And that's a history of the leadership. From the guy on the left, who was a dictator for for over 30 years. And then the transition guy, Habibi there, the Muslim cleric who helped cement human rights and democracy in Indonesia, the Sukarno, who was the daughter of, well, Sukarno's not on this picture, but he was the guy who was overthrown. That was his daughter. And up to Joko Widodo, who is really, it proves that democracy can work because the country is really, really corrupt. But the people have done a really great job of choosing the best leaders. And Joko Widodo, who I knew when he was a mayor of a small town in Solo, he's a really cool guy too. He likes what's it called, metallic rock?
Heavy metal. Yeah.
Heavy metal. Tells you how hip I am. Anyway, and he's really a man of the people. And President Obama lived in Indonesia for almost 5 years, and this is on a visit when he went there. That means that Indonesia is a part of me. So people love him, and he loves Indonesia. So that's just my overview. And I'm going to come back because the rest of it is about the exchange program and a description of the location of the university, which I'll do with Cloud. So I can turn it over to the next speaker.
Oh, okay. Thank you. My name is Carla Jones, and I'm an anthropologist. I go to Jogja every year. It is a sort of second home for me. And part of the reason for that is because I went on a study abroad program to Gajah Mada University when I was a sophomore in college. So I'm here to tell you that it's a good choice. Sure it is, good. I grew up in Southeast Asia, and I visited Indonesia a lot as a child, but it was really the fact that I went on that study abroad program to Gajah Mada University in the early 90s that introduced me to a city that I really just feel is a piece of me now. And the university itself is also a place that I both have studied and also teach at sometimes as well. Yogyakarta is a university city, and as a result, it's a young city. So Stan just described how Indonesia is a burgeoning, blossoming economy. It is also a sort of demographically young economy, and Yogyakarta is a beautiful example of both of those things sort of coming together. So Indonesia has, over the last several decades, really grown economically. And in that period of time, there are sort of two things that have happened simultaneously. One is that there's been the development of a burgeoning middle class, and by some measures, the percentage of the Indonesian population that's middle class rivals that of the United States, a country that imagines itself as middle class. Whereas we tend to think about Indonesia as a developing or poor country. In fact, it has a burgeoning urban consuming middle class. The other thing that happened during that same period of time, particularly post-Suharto, following the end of his rule in 1998, has been the proliferation of new forms of sort of self-identity and group identity that were not as prevalent before when he was in power. And that has been most obvious in the proliferation of forms of religious piety. So we have in Indonesia the proliferation of both a consuming middle class and a new identity of a kind of pride in Islamic practice and lifestyle that often is expressed then through consumer habits, actually, the ways that people shop and buy. And this is most evident when you look at consumer culture among young people. So if you look at college students in Jogja, you can see all these things sort of happening at once. These are a few young friends that are now not as young as they look in this picture. But I'll just emphasize what Stan pointed out. They're happy, they're smiling. And this contradicts a lot of Western stereotypes about Muslim women in particular, women who adopt modest dress or covered clothing, that they are not miserable, that they live creative, happy lives. These are other friends who were part of a movement in many cities. This was actually in Jakarta, of what are called hijabers communities. These are actually not middle class, these are elite women who get together and share their affection for a kind of bourgeois style of Muslim practice. These are day-long events where they have sermons and they have fashion shows at the same time. And they take lots of selfies. The Indonesian government has realized that this youth culture is, and this sort of segment of sort of Islamic piety has become a new avenue for economic development. So the government has invested substantially in promoting the growth of the kinds of pious industries that we might associate with Muslim lifestyle, and dress and fashion are at the top of that list. In fact, there's a new government ministry just dedicated to the creative economies, and Islamic dress is at the top of that list for government funding. Indonesia has set for itself a target of becoming the Qiblat, or the Mecca of the global modest fashion industry. They're competing with other places like, you can imagine Turkey or Gulf states. This is evident in some of the kinds of formal Islamic fashion fairs that happen all the time. They're very frequent, and a lot of them are in Jogja, and they're fun sort of party-like environments where people get together and buy things. Part of what the Indonesian government is doing in trying to promote this industry is to emphasize the unique capacity that Indonesia has to create this kind of attractive garment industry through channeling the long-standing both garment industries in mass production, but also through channeling the creative textile traditions that are present in Indonesia. This is just one example of some of the incredibly beautiful batik. And I can tell you, I still have, this is not my piece, but I still have sarongs that I bought that first summer that I was in Jogja at Gajah Mada, and they're faded, but they're really soft now. These are just some of the other fun snapshots of fashion shows that happen both in Jogja and in Jakarta, often in hotels. And you can see a kind of channeling, again, of textile traditions. These are examples of fashion magazines that have become very popular. And not only are they sold as new magazines, but at Gajah Mada, there is a Sunday fair, sort of used goods fair, where people sell old magazines. And I love going with graduate students, and we just stroll around and we eat snacks, and I buy old magazines. And you can see there's a lot of English in this, right? Which is not simply because there is an increasing presence of the use of English by middle-class Indonesians, but also because for the sort of denotation of the idea of sort of a cosmopolitan perspective or global persona, using and having access to English suggests a certain kind of sophistication. This is just one last fun picture. I'll just pause briefly to say that there's another feature to this youth culture in Jogja that I find especially fascinating, and that is that there's an incredible sense of creativity. Rachel is going to talk about that in more detail, but the other flip side, and you might think of this as something that's common to college towns, is that there's also a lot of energy around youth activism. And so what you also find in Jogja is a very politically active community of NGOs, foundations, communities, clubs on campus as well as off campus that are populated with students who are really caring about the future. And what they are fighting for is really interesting. What they consider to be urgent is really interesting. And these are pictures from protests that occurred in September in downtown Jogja by young people who organized to protest what they felt were weakening attempts by the legislature to weaken the anti-corruption laws. So they got together, they fought hard, and the women who are in this picture and in the next one are women who are really engaged and active in a feminist organization in Jogja, but which lent their support and their voice to the protests around anti-corruption movements. So I will just close by simply saying that when the 2008 crisis happened in the US, one of the sort of renowned scholars of Indonesian studies happened to be visiting campus here to give a talk, and she came to my globalization class, and it was a room full of students like this, and the students were sort of depressed and demoralized, and they turned to her and asked, well, so what do we do now? It just feels like the world is falling apart. We don't know what the next steps are. And she smiled broadly, and she said, look to Indonesia. That's where the energy is. That's where the activism is. That's where the kind of populism that should be inspiring is. And I say that all the time to everybody. I'm like, look to Indonesia. So Rachel will tell us more.
So I want to talk about, if I can get this up here, a related form of creative expression, also in Jogja. So for those of you, a few of you here know me and know that my first book was a study of women's activism in Indonesia, and most of that research was done in Jakarta. And one of the things that kept happening over and over again as I was studying activists, and I came into contact during that research with a lot of different social movement activists in the country, and also found their activism very inspiring. But I kept finding these intersections with the art world. I found, there were activists who were both sort of involved in activism and involved in the art world. For example, there were often events that brought activists and artists together. So a few years ago, I began studying the contemporary art scene, which happens to be, although there are sort of art scenes in several different cities in Indonesia, Jogja is really sort of the heart of the art scene, and it always kind of has been. It's generally considered Indonesia's cultural capital. But for a long time, that was expressed through what we could call more sort of traditional art forms, crafts, for example, music, dance, performance. And it's really only in the past 20 years since democratization that this very interesting and very cutting edge visual art scene has emerged in the city. And in fact, it really kind of grew out of the activist scene, and many of the people who are artists now were very dedicated student activists back during the days of the democracy movement in the late 90s. And many of them, the art there tends to often be quite politicized in all sorts of interesting ways. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about, show a few pictures of some of this art and talk about what I've been seeing in the past few years. That's just a nice photo I found on the internet, not my photo, but just to give you sort of a sense of, it's actually a very beautiful city with volcanoes kind of surrounding it. Although unfortunately there's often a fair amount of smog and it can be hard to see them, but on a good day you get those kinds of views. Just that's sort of more typical weather. It is one of the things I think that, it makes sense to me that a really exciting art scene would take root in this city, because it has long had this history of being a hub of creative expression, of activism. During the days of the dictatorship from 1965 to 1998, it was one of the places where there was sort of a little bit more free expression allowed. And so there's always been sort of a creativity and often kind of a quirkiness to the culture of this city. And people from there tend to be very proud of that. So, for example, one of my feminist activist friends recently built this house for herself. She was reaching her 40s. She was single. She didn't have any kids. She decided she wanted to sort of be rooted somewhere in a house. And so she designed and built this very unusual eco house all on her own in a village outside Jogja. And I think it's really telling about Jogja that she can do that, and she can live there as, a single woman, a very kind of quirky character in this village, and, that she's very much accepted there. So that's when I visited her there a few years ago. Jogja has, in the last couple decades, all sorts of interesting kind of art and cultural events have emerged in Jogja. One of the signature events is this event called Art Jog, which is an art fair that takes place every year. Draws artists from across Indonesia, but also even international artists as well, although it's really meant to showcase Indonesian artists. So I've been watching this event for several years. And so I just wanted to show some of the really exciting work that appears there. This is a little hard to see, it's kind of bright. But this is this big glass dome that is an installation that was mounted right outside the front door. And inside the dome was this, and it's a reef and it's crocheted. So it's a really monumental work by a fairly well-known Indonesian artist. It attracted a lot of attention, and it was really a comment about Indonesia has incredible marine biodiversity, but it's very much under threat from overfishing and pollution and the warming oceans and so on. So, this was a real comment about, being able to kind of preserve this incredible and unique biodiversity. And as you can see, the art is, it tends to be fairly avant-garde. A lot of it, some of it's figurative, some of it's abstract. You see a lot of different styles. The organizers of this event and some of the other art-related events do a lot to try to make things accessible, and that's one of the things I've been struck by. Indonesia doesn't have a lot of museums, for example, compared to more affluent countries where you'd have, a lot of sort of elite art institutions. There aren't very many of those in Indonesia. There's no sort of museum of contemporary art, for example, no, equivalent of MoMA in New York. So instead, you have these kinds of events as well as a huge network of small, privately funded galleries. And then occasionally some art collectors who will open up their homes by appointment. So the organizers of the events, like ArtJog, do a lot to make these events low cost, usually, either very low cost or even sometimes free. They advertise them very widely. They reach out to schools and try to get school groups to come. This was actually the curator of the event a couple years ago, and so they do these everyday curatorial tours that are very extensive. This one was like 2 hours long. And they had English and Japanese interpreters going along as well, because they attract a fair amount of foreigners to these exhibits. So they really do a lot to make it accessible. And these are just a few of the works. This is by a very well-known Indonesian artist that came out of a kind of radical art collective called Taring Padi, that was very active in the democracy struggles and does this sort of woodcut style art. And they initially became very famous for just making these political posters and pasting them all over Jogja, and then working with a lot of small rural villages, getting a sense of what were people's biggest concerns and then making posters about them. And so many of the members of this collective, like this artist, his name is Ucup, have become quite well known now in their own right, and have sort of gone on to make their own work and exhibit it pretty widely internationally, and are actually commanding fairly high prices. But they tend to remain very true to this original vision of sort of art for the people. So they use a lot of sort of historic Indonesian imagery in their work. Another example of one of the things they do to make these exhibits sort of publicly accessible, this was at the very end of ArtJog. One of the artists created this gigantic mural, and then they cut it into little squares, each about this big, and auctioned off the squares, and they were all like under $10. So they were very low price. So a lot of people came and were able to purchase a little, including me, a little piece of this mural. And so you can sort of get a sense here of the crowds, and it's become very popular for young people in the city to go to these art events, which is very interesting because a lot of the scholars of artistic culture in the West have emphasized how sort of avant-garde art tends to be inaccessible, tends to be challenging, tends to not attract wide audiences, and is not commercially successful. And so in some ways what we see here is sort of the opposite of that, where even work that's very abstract is able to reach these large audiences of young people. Another striking feature of the art scene in Jogja is the presence of women artists, many of whom have a very strong kind of feminist take. And so this is one of Indonesia's best-known women artists, Tita Ruby is her name. And she's most famous for, this is actually a work of hers that's currently in Singapore in a museum, in one of the major museums in Singapore. And so she created her own version of David. And it's really monumental and very, has attracted a lot of attention. And she really sees this as partly, a way for a woman artist from the periphery to kind of insert herself into the international discourse of art. This is another of her pieces. Most of them are sculptures. But you also see a lot of sort of everyday art events. This was at a small gallery complex, and it was an opening, and they had a discussion with the visiting artists, some of whom were from Australia and some of whom were from other parts of Indonesia. And this was free and attracted a pretty big crowd. It can also get political, as much does in Jogja, and so one year Art Jog, one of the corporate sponsors for Art Jog, since they do tend to look for corporate sponsorship since they don't really have funds otherwise. So one of the corporate sponsors was the Freeport Mining Company, which is very controversial both within Indonesia and internationally for its mining practices. And so there was a protest basically against that sponsorship by Freeport. This is also just, to give you sort of a sense of these galleries that are around in Jogja. Many of them are fairly small scale, sort of homemade. So a few of them are kind of fancy, but they really vary. This one, the curator is actually this guy Arham, who worked as a research assistant for me when I first started studying contemporary art, and so now he's gone on to be both the curator of this gallery, and then most recently he actually curated the most recent Biennale in Jogja. So that hopefully just gives you a sense of the kind of creative dynamism going on in Jogja these days. And one of the things the other thing I think that is also quite striking is that, I think there's a lot of stereotypes about majority Muslim societies, and particularly restrictions on creative expression. But, I think for Indonesia, we can see very clearly that, with democratization, there has been this very strong Islamic revival, and yet there's also been a very strong upsurge of creative expression. And from talking with artists, I have asked many of the artists and curators if they have ever encountered problems, if they've been critiqued, if they've had their work blocked. And for the most part, they said no, that this has not been an issue for them. And that, in fact, they have found the public very receptive to their art, even when, it can be sometimes fairly challenging in terms of, showing nudity, being political, and so on. There have only been a few, incidents where there was sort of pushback. And that tends to only, involve art that is specifically about a couple very contentious political issues. So for the most part, there really are not, despite there being some legislation in recent years that many activists and artists consider problematic around pornography, this doesn't seem to have put a damper at all on the art scene. And, these days it's actually considered, Indonesia regularly gets picked as sort of having one of the world's hottest art scenes. And it's attracted a lot of attention from international collectors and so on. Stop there. Yeah.
Record that. Okay. So I'm just curious, who here has been to Indonesia? Anybody? More than most crowds. How many here are interested in the study abroad program and the study abroad in Indonesia? Anybody? You are? Not one person? Okay, well maybe we can recruit you by the time we're done. So So I'm going to focus a little bit more on Yogyakarta and just add a little bit to what they said. It's in a part of Indonesia that's called Central Java, and Central Java is kind of the historical and cultural heartland of Indonesia. Yogyakarta itself, the Sultanate there, goes back to the 9th century, and they've had a continuous hereditary sultan ever since then. And while in Indonesia they really don't recognize royalty anymore, they got rid of that a long time ago, but the Sultan of Yogyakarta is so respected that he was elected the governor of the special district of Yogyakarta. So this is a country that is both modern and very traditional. And Indonesia is very, very traditional. So you'll see a lot of people dressed like this, a lot of scenes like this. People people still use the dokar, the horse cart, and the pedicabs for transportation. What Rachel said about the artistic values is a really, really important thing to understand about Indonesia, because Indonesians are very, very artistic, and you know, it really stems from their religion and their traditions. But be it textiles or batik painting or modern painting or dance or theater or music, gamelan music, there's an extraordinary flourishing, and it always has been very rich. And so it's a wonderful thing about Indonesia. And they do use art to express everything, including political dissent. In Yogyakarta, they have the Yogyakarta hip hop group, which is like one of the most popular groups in the country, and they specialize in political hip hop criticism. And also, about 5 years ago, a friend of mine who was a Fulbright scholar in Yogyakarta, studying graffiti art, he participated in a graffiti art protest against hotel development, which actually had an impact on that. So this is the Sultan's Palace, which goes back to the 9th century. And, you know, there's just like art and silverwork and goldwork and textiles just everywhere in Yogyakarta. Then I said you have a syncretism of Buddhism and Hinduism. It's hard to distinguish sometimes between them, but they have some of the most magnificent temples in the world. And this is the Hindu temple. And one reason why like sort of pornographic art is accepted is that Hindu art is actually very pornographic by nature. So it's part of the Indonesian tradition, and the Arab influence has not been able to suppress that. It's about 45 minutes from the ocean, from the Indian Ocean, and that's a beach there. So there's sea nearby, and this is just some other scenes of things that are very, very close to Yogyakarta. Volcanoes, river rafting, jungles, all kinds of beautiful things. And so here we are at the Universitas Gajah Mada, which is where the exchanges will take place. It's a very large university. It's the country's best university. And, you know, a large percentage, you know, maybe 30, 40, 50% of the nation's leaders have graduated from Gajah Mada. Yogyakarta itself is always an avant-garde city. It's always on the leading of every single social movement, and those social movements for Yogyakarta are liberal. They're the democracy movement. A lot of the democracy leaders came from there. A lot of the democracy movement that led to democracy in 1999 was actually led by artists. And something about Indonesians is Indonesians are just a really cool, hip people. Okay, so they're just funny, and they have a great sense of humor. They love to dance. They love to sing, and they just have a really, really cool personality. A lot of the guys wear long hair. They dress cool. So they're just fun to be around, and you know, that's how I can describe them. So anyway, so now I wanted to ask Cloud if you want to talk a little bit about the actual exchange program.
Yeah, sure. We have a good mix of folks in the room. I don't know how many are interested in studying abroad. My name is Cloud Bafor, and I'm the program manager in the Education Abroad office. We're located in the C4C, and I can send brochures around if folks are interested. This program we're launching for fall 2020. The application deadline is coming up February 15th. For students that are interested in applying, if you haven't been to our office before, our website has a Getting Started page We offer a short session called Abroad 101 that allows you to get to know how study abroad works for you within your degree, how credits can transfer, and how financial aid can apply to the programs. That session's offered as a quick online video, or you can attend it in person, offered weekly on Wednesdays. The application itself is built within our website, and you can log in with your CU identity and start filling pieces out. There's going to be an application process with the university as well. This is a brand new exchange, so we will probably be accepting a small number of students in the first year, maybe 3 to 5. 5 would probably be a lot, but we would be really excited to see this partnership grow. We know that Indonesia has a number of, that UGM has a number of partnerships around the world, but we're going to be their first exchange in mainland U.S. They do host a lot of U.S. groups and summer programs, and there's a lot of really amazing opportunities at their university to take courses and get involved in community service programs. But the partnership that we've been able to form thanks to the Center of Asian Studies and STAN's partnership, that our students will now be able to take and integrate fully at the institution and take courses alongside local students and other international students studying abroad. So it's a really exciting opportunity. It's available for fall, and if you're interested in applying for programs, please contact us.
Thanks, Scott. So we have some time for questions about the exchange program, or just any other questions about Indonesia for Claude or any of our panelists. So.
Yeah. How many countries are you targeting right now? Indonesia is one. Any other country? For the study abroad?
For study abroad, we offer over 400 programs all over the world, but if you're asking about Southeast Asia, we do have an exchange in Singapore as well, and we have a few in Australia, New Zealand, students study in South Korea.
Is it for one semester?
People can go for a semester. We have summer programs.
And how many credits does a student get for that program?
Yeah, for a semester program, the Indonesian credit system is very familiar to what we're used to in the U.S. in terms of lecture hours and credits. So most of the courses appear to be 3 credits, from what I can tell. So it would be a standard 12 to 18 credits that you would take abroad.
And how much is the tuition for that?
So an exchange program is designed to be based on the CU in-state tuition, and then the students at their local institution pay their tuition and students swap. So it's a reciprocal exchange. So exchange programs tend to be fairly affordable for in-state students. The program fees aren't officially posted yet, but there are sample budgets up that you can look at with Singapore and New Zealand. It will be posted shortly.
I should just add that they have dozens and dozens and dozens of courses that are offered in English, because they actually have an international program there that is for Indonesian students, and foreign students can enroll in it, and all the courses are taught in English. So, everything, there's a lot of courses in the social sciences, but also in biology and other fields. So I think there's an ample enough courses, if you plan carefully, to be able to meet your graduation requirements. That you're not going to miss out on credits that you need to graduate.
So when you were talking about just how the lack of museums and they were more just accessible, just pop-ups in a way, would you say that's due to their importance and significance with their temples? Because I would consider kind of the temples as their own museums. Would you say that's why there's kind of a divide in the lack of museums, because the temples are kind of their museums?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's definitely a way to look at it, and they do have a lot of temples and other historic monuments. So yeah, I mean, what you don't find are the sort of art museums, right? That you would like the Louvre or MoMA or the Metro, those kinds of things. Partly because those require, huge investments, right, on the part of both, usually government entities as well as, very wealthy philanthropists. And so, but I think there's certainly growing interest in having those kinds of institutions in Indonesia. One of the things that's happened in Jogja in recent years is that the city government has, I think, much like with Islamic fashion, they've come to the realization that that art is a money generator for the city, and so they've started to sponsor some of the art events. So I think, as in the last few years, a few private collectors have funded their own sort of small private art museums. And I think some of those may eventually kind of grow into larger institutions. I mean, that's certainly, I think the visual artists sort of feel a lack of those kinds of institutions. And they're sort of frustrated that they, if they want their work to be shown in a more kind of large scale way other than the art fairs, in sort of like a permanent sense, that they have to have it shown in Singapore or Australia or Japan, right? And so they'd like to have those kinds of institutions in Indonesia as well. So there are a lot of conversations about how that could develop.
Practical things I forgot to mention, just living there. So there is dormitory housing, but Indonesians and foreign students, they almost all live off campus, very close to campus, and you can either choose to rent like a small room, and essentially it's like a boarding house with your own small bathroom in your room, or you can even, it's pretty affordable to even get like a small apartment, a real simple apartment, but with a bathroom, kitchen, and everything. Air conditioning, internet, all that. So actually, it's pretty comfortable, the living situation. And if we get students to sign up for it, especially, I'll be there when you arrive. So I've already planned my schedule in Indonesia to be there at the beginning of the fall and spring semesters for the next year at least. So.
Yeah, that's the question.
I wanted to ask a little bit more of a broad question about socioeconomic class and ethnic divide. Specifically, Chinese Indonesian, so my mother's Chinese Indonesian, and I've been many times to Indonesia, and I find the class divide is huge. And recently there's been some contemporary authors that I've met who write from this class in English, and some translated novels, which is very new in terms of literature, and pretty exciting that young writers or new writers are actually being seen by Western audiences. But I was wondering about the current situation. Is there still this extreme divide, like educationally, politically, class-wise, and is there any movement for these people to, for Chinese Indonesians specifically, but of course, surely there's many, many groups of people that also don't mix. Is there kind of movement for them to come closer together in some ways?
Well, I think there's been a lot of change in the past 20 years. And, I first went to Indonesia in 1990, and it was at that time, completely acceptable to use kind of racist language talking about Chinese Indonesians, right? They were really deeply othered. And in the past 20 years, I think that has changed a lot. That has become much more unacceptable. Not to say that I think there is still a divide. There's definitely still intolerance. I would say, fairly high levels in certain areas of Indonesia. But the change that I have seen is that the highly educated, the people who have a university education, I think by and large have come to, I think there's been a lot more of a recognition about how problematic that sort of othering is. Now, whether that has translated into, are we seeing intermarriage or friendships and so on?
Not even friendships.
Yeah.
In my experience, I was not allowed to go out by myself outside our social circle.
Mm-hmm.
And I had no idea what it was to be in, not in a mall or in a car driven by a driver.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was not allowed.
Right. I mean, I think that has subsided to some degree. I mean, certainly in Jakarta, from what I've seen, but Yeah, I mean, it remains, it's kind of a simultaneous class and ethnic divide. I mean, I think, certainly the laws have changed, and that the kind of discrimination, the legal discrimination that used to exist has changed to a great extent, although not fully. There are, celebrations of Chinese holidays are now, widely advertised, and lots of people go to them. People feel a lot freer now to take on Chinese names in a way that, and to speak, Chinese dialects in a way that they didn't used to be able to. So, I mean, those sorts of changes have happened. But yeah, I mean, Indonesia is a complicated society, I think, and there are these class, ethnic, and religious divides, and I think that's probably the strongest one. So it's still there to some extent, but in Jakarta and Jogja and the major cities, I think it has subsided somewhat.
Do you know the percentage of Chinese Indonesians in the country?
There are not very good numbers for it, because there are a lot of folks of mixed heritage that don't list it on surveys. So, but the estimates I've seen are in the range of 3%. Yeah.
I think there's more mixed marriage than people realize.
Yeah.
And what you're describing is really interesting because, on the one hand, Rachel is describing decades of anti-Chinese sentiment, and I think that was most evident, and sort of the peak was in 1965. And yet you're also describing within the Chinese community anxiety about mixing out, right?
Fear.
And
right,
fear,
from
exactly, right.
98.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Killings.
Yeah.
So both of these, but part of what happened after 98 was then new laws that specifically said that anti-Chinese sentiment was not to be tolerated. So it doesn't mean that it doesn't still exist or that it's not latent. In the many examples I know of intermarriage, the thing that has been the deal breaker, or the thing that is actually still part of the law, is that people have to be of the same religion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that all of the cases I know of Chinese individuals who have married across, their partner either converted to Christianity or they converted to Islam, which is part of just Indonesian law. You can't marry across religions. So that becomes another factor through which you have the kind of reproduction of ethnic or not.
Carla, I don't know if everyone would know what happened in '98.
So in 1998, the public protests that were central to bringing down Suharto were resisted by the government. The state sent out both formal military and secret police to attack and terrorize public protesters so as to prevent them, or to drive fear, so as to try and shut down the resistance. And one of the more pernicious strategies that the secret police used was to single out Chinese women, some of whom were not protesters, and sexually assault them and or kill them. And so there was a whole sort of sexist and racist underbelly to the government resistance to the resistance itself that was horrible. And what was particularly striking about it was that there were a number of college students who were killed in those protests and who became martyrs and heroes of that movement, but they were young men. So the particular version of this violence that was especially tragic was also erased in some ways and not made as public, or those deaths were not considered, or that trauma was not considered as tragic or as valuable. But it's precisely in the years since that people have started to talk about it, and as Rachel points out, it has now become a way in which many middle-class Indonesians and elite Indonesians understand themselves to have come a long ways, right? Doesn't mean that it's actually true, but it's certainly a rhetorical, and we see this in other kind of racial hierarchies around the world, right, where people understand themselves to be enlightened precisely because of their attitudes around otherness. I'll just say one last thing, that there's in all of this ethnic, diversity that you see in Indonesia, the other group that actually has an awful lot of high intermarriage and sort of suspicion of outsiders is actually Hadramis, people of Arab descent as well. So it's not just Chinese Indonesians. There's all of these sorts of outsider, syncretic, as Stan was saying. Indonesia is this place where, because it's at the confluence of two major oceans and trading, has this just centuries of outsider arrivals and different religions, different philosophies, different intellectual traditions, and that has produced this vibrant society. But it also means that you have communities that can trace their own genealogies back 15 generations or something. People who know their own family trees in a way that Americans don't.
And to very different parts of the world.
Very different parts of the world.
I'd just like to add one thing. I want to go on, put on my former deputy political counselor hat, reporting on these sort of issues, okay, and reaching out to all the different ethnic groups. So there's a certain validation to what you're saying. What they're saying is it is a lot more integrated now. It's gotten 1,000 times better and safer for the Chinese. They can now use their Chinese names. They can get into politics a little bit more. State universities still don't give very many slots for ethnic Chinese, so they go to private universities. That's really is not good for the education system. But just as race is used in the United States and Hungary and elsewhere for politics, race, particularly the Chinese card, and the Islam card for that matter, but the Chinese card is used in Indonesia, and it's been used recently. So the President Jokowi, the person who I love so much, I keep talking about him, he appointed as his deputy governor or mayor of Jakarta a very successful mayor from Batam, ethnic Chinese guy. And Jokowi, he went on to become president. So this guy Ahok, he became mayor of Jakarta. And a really good mayor. People loved him. He did tremendous things, the first good mayor they've had in decades. But political opposition, because they were being cut off from the gravy train of corruption because of him, they mounted an opposition to him. And it's easy to do in Indonesia. It's easy to pull the Chinese card. It's easy to say, this guy's Chinese, or we don't trust him. He's communist, which he wasn't. And not just so anyway, they used this to defeat him with somebody who was really corrupt. Okay. This guy's so corrupt that, anyway, this guy Ahok, he actually still has a political career. The worst thing was he was put in prison for blasphemy because he had the gall to make a statement, a political statement regarding the Quran, which is that in Islam you're free to elect non-Muslims. I mean, it violated the blasphemy law, supposedly. It's all corrupt. He was in prison. He's out of prison. But the president has put him in charge of one of the most powerful ministries now. And the president himself has been accused, a la Trump versus Obama, of being ethnic Chinese Christian, okay? Which is in the United States, it's the same as being accused as being ethnic, Muslim ethnic.
Kenyan Muslim.
Yes, Muslim.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is validated, because even recently, as Jokowi was elected the second time, they mounted all these protests in Jakarta, okay, to try to, nationwide in fact, to try to bring his government down. But the protests could only go as far as the money they had to pay protesters, so they fizzled out pretty quickly. But the Chinese, whenever these sort of things happen, the ethnic Chinese in Jakarta are afraid, and they stay inside. It happens from time to time, but it's their country. They do well there, they do well economically, and so they stay, unless it gets too ugly, like in 1998, and then they leave. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of Chinese money is still in Singapore. Another reason is because a lot of it is corrupt and they don't want to pay taxes. But anyway, Anyway, I'm sorry, I just had to add that, because I usually talk about that when I talk about Indonesia.
It's wonderful to hear your very upbeat, optimistic take. But I have, having lived in Malaysia for a long time, taught in Singapore for a long time, all those nice, interesting, syncretic things you mentioned existed in Malaysia. Of course, if you go around talking to academics, talk to certain cliques of people, you find this wonderful syncretism amongst different races. But the macro picture is something else. 80% of Muslims say non-Christians cannot use the word Allah in their Bible, right, which is against the norm. In Indonesia, the removal of ahak, basically by religious forces, I would say, right? Is something that is worrisome because Indonesians used to tell me, what's wrong with these Malaysians? They're so extremist in their religion. And now Malaysians are saying, hey, those guys are trying to emulate us or they're exceeding us. At one level, yes, middle class religiosity, but somehow it seems easily manipulated to a kind of ugly politics. So it's not sufficient. The nice consumerism, a nice word, piteous consumerism, may not be able to resist at the more macro level ugly forms of politics. So I don't know what your thoughts are on this gap.
Well, I'd like to make a quick comment that Malaysia would have gone a different way if Anwar Ibrahim had not been put in prison by Mahathir back in the 1980s.
True, but his Abim movement, some people say, has been at the forefront of a lot of Islamization. In fact, he was the pioneer of a lot of Islamization when he was in government. There was a concession to him. So people at this point are still a bit worried about Anwar, which way will he swing in many ways. I don't know, so. But it's up to me. If the micro, if the elite middle class micro situation in fact grows to be the macro, that'd be wonderful. But I sometimes see the gap.
I think I should probably say a little bit. I completely agree that there is a sort of optimistic, triumphalist strategy on the part of those who stand to benefit from turning religious affiliation or any kind of group affiliation or identity into a commodity form, right? What's striking in Indonesia is actually that the resistance to Suharto, one of the very active forms and formal forms of resistance to Suharto, was religious, right? So the Indonesian government until '98 was constantly trying to shut down these forms of overt religiosity. The most visible form of this was in women's appearance. So the headscarf was not allowed in civil service positions, in public schools, and it became synonymous with a kind of anti-authoritarian position, which was hard for Suharto. He started to have to sort of up his own religiosity. He started going on the Hajj more. His own daughters covered. There's this semiotic game that goes back and forth. What's striking is that the Indonesian government, because time has passed and the landscape has changed, has gone full circle now. Has totally radically shifted and is now pouring money into the cultivation of these industries as a way of creating a kind of international reputation that's the Islam Nusantara, the friendly Islam, right? It's also part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So these are strategic decisions on the part of the state. Nonetheless, for individuals, there's still suspicion, right? So what I really study is, in fact, the ways in which people talk about the proliferation of these forms in ways that reveal that there's actually no unified sense of what this transformation really means. And that there is, in fact, anxiety about the sincerity of these forms, and/or there is anxiety about the manipulability of these forms. The fact that these are associated with wealth. The hijabers community, which I showed one picture of, has come in for enormous critique, because the joke is that you can't even really walk through the doors of these clubs or these meetings without arriving in a Mercedes, right? That you have to have the right kind of handbag. All of the kind of anxiety and debate about consumption that we see in other parts of the world. So it's not a simple single story, but for the designers that I know who are creating and working in this industry, they walk a very fine tightrope of wanting to, on the one hand, welcome and create as many new future consumers as possible, and use their high visibility and status to potentially influence particular political positions. And so some of these women designers that I know will sometimes reveal during election campaigns who they vote for, and other times won't. But that just tells you exactly what Stan is saying, which is that this is a fine sort of terrain. It's not simple. And I actually think the fact that it's not simple is evidence of the vitality. Here I'm going to reveal my own bias, which is that many Indonesians look to Malaysia as a boring place. You know, like there's so much more interesting stuff going on.
Okay, well, we will have a fight now about the food, but many of us have to be in other places soon. I have to teach soon, so I will call an end to the formal part of the procedure and invite people to continue the conversation if there's time offline, if you will. But just to close with, I think one of the things that has been so interesting about the exchange and the questions and the conversation that we've had, as you would expect from one of the largest countries in the world, Indonesia is complex, complicated. There's a lot to learn. And hopefully our program with Gajah Mada University is a step towards enabling that and continuing that for our students and for everyone else.